Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos and I've just come back from the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, which is an intense experience, and not just because so many of the shows take place in marquees. Well, the good news, as you can probably hear in my voice, is that the Edinburgh Festival Fringe of 2022 took place at all. And better than that, it was very much like a return to the fringes that we've known here on Musical Talk for the last 15 years. It doesn't need explaining, but of course in 2020 there was no fringe at all because of COVID, and the year after, in 2021, whilst there were a few performances and shows which made their way to Edinburgh, it really couldn't be described as a fringe in any real sense, and indeed most of the things that we discussed here on Musical Talk were virtually available. This year, Edinburgh is back both virtually and physically. Some shows were virtual, but by far the majority this year could be seen in person, and I went up there in person to see them, so I can prove that this is true. And I had a marvellous time. But there were some differences this year. It was overall, whilst busy on a day-to-day basis, a smaller festival fringe this year. Now, you wouldn't necessarily say that it was anything other than chock-a-block full of people, because it was, but the number of shows was slightly reduced on previous years when there were normal, in speech marks, festival fringes taking place. And it was also true tangibly in the air. I think if you were to walk down the Royal Mile this year, which is usually absolutely thronging, it's almost impossible to get from one end to the other without jostling, that you actually could do so without any kind of physical human contact. I don't mean that in an inappropriate way, but what I do mean is there were normally bottlenecks and areas where it was really difficult to pass, and you would have to sort of go through with your shoulders first, trying to make a path. Not true this year. Plenty of atmosphere, plenty of liveliness, and still street performers, but fewer, and noticeably fewer, than in the past. Also, I would say that there was a move in terms of the centre of gravity slightly. In the past, the Royal Mile has always been the absolute focus for getting your show out there. That's where the flyers are. That's normally where the street performers are, and it's normally where people who have got other shows can attend one of the little mini fringe stages and perform an extract of their show for 10 minutes for advertising purposes. It's where you go to meet everybody else who's performing or wants to see a show, essentially. This year, whilst that's still true, there were no stages on the mile, really, and so actually the number of people doing performances was down. And as I say, the number of people there was down in that sense that you could move from one end to the other without too much jostling, whereas I think if you went to the Bristow Square, the Teviot Square, the George Square area, which is all around the area that is sort of described by the Pleasance Dome at one end and the George Square Assembly and Underbelly at the other, with the Gilded Balloon Teviot in the middle, then that area itself was much busier this year. And that seems to be now where there's a lot more flyering taking place. Now, I'm not going to go into any more detail on how the Fringe felt this year, because what I want to do in this episode is to highlight to you what were indeed the, and I've used the word already, highlights of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe for someone who's a lover of musical theatre. And the wonderful thing is that the shows that we're going to showcase in this week's episode are all still available to see at the Fringe. And I'll be giving details of how you can do so in case you're thinking of attending Edinburgh this year to see something in the final week of the Fringe itself. Remember, it closes over the bank holiday weekend, but performances continue until the 28th and 29th of August, so all the shows that you can hear about in this episode still have performances available to see, and that is a wonderful thing. And there were so many wonderful highlights that actually there'll be another episode next week where we'll be talking about shows which have already closed, but they all absolutely deserve being spoken about here on Musical Talk because they were all 4 or 5-star musical theatre shows. And shows that I think that you'll be interested in hearing about. Which is lucky, because that's what we're going to be doing this week and next week. As usual, this is our Edinburgh Festival Roundup episode, one of two this year, and what you'll be getting are a number of songs from the shows where the creators have allowed us to play their music, and also 10-minute extracts from interviews that I conducted with people behind these shows. And as always, it's a plethora of different talents and connections with these musical shows. There are actors, directors, composers, performers, you name it. There'll be someone here who can represent that particular part of the world of musical theatre. So I'm hoping that this will be an interesting programme for you and a taster of episodes to come, because each of the interviews from which we've taken these excerpts will be played in full over the next few weeks and months here on Musical Talk, so that you can get to hear what it's like to put on a show, create a show, appear in a show from this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. So whether or not you made it to Edinburgh in 2022 for the Fringe, you will at least, I hope, get a sense of what it was like and what the shows were like. So, talking of shows, let's get this one on the road. And we're going to start with an excerpt of a conversation I had with a wonderful man by the name of Matthew Floyd Jones about this year's Musical Talk pick of the Fringe. That's right, the show that we thought was the best new musical that you could see at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. And I can tell you, we weren't alone, because this show has been garnering stars from all corners of the press and media. And the show is called Cathy and Stella Solve a Murder. It's a brilliant musical, and the word of mouth on it in Edinburgh this year has been amazing. Extra shows have actually been laid on to deal with the demand, and quite rightly so. What's it about? Well, it's a comedy musical theatre piece, and I'll read you the blurb from the Ed Fringe website. Best friends forever, Cathy and Stella host Hull's least successful true crime podcast. When their favourite author is killed, they are thrust into a thrilling whodunit of their own. Can they crack the case and become global podcast superstars before the killer strikes again? A hilarious murder mystery musical from the Olivia Award-winning team behind Fleabag, Baby Reindeer, and A Super Happy Story About Feeling Super Sad, written by John Britton and Matthew Floyd Jones. And what's on stage has already said you'd be hard-pushed to find a better musical at this year's Fringe and given it 5 stars, as did we here on Musical Talk. And as I say, we made it our pick of the Fringe. So, let's hear a 10-minute excerpt from the conversation I had with the super lovely Matthew Floyd Jones, who is the composer of this piece and who also has an enormous history both at the Fringe and in British show business over the last decade or so in relation to cabaret and musical theatre. He's a wonderful man, and I must say this was one of my favourite conversations at the Fringe overall anyway, because he's so witty and knowledgeable, and just generally he turned out to be one of the loveliest people I've ever met. Let's hear Matthew Floyd Jones talking about jamming an overture and the role of music in a musical beyond the songs in what I think is a truly interesting extract from our conversation about Cathy and Stella Solve a Murder. But before that, we have a special treat because we've been given permission to play 2 of the songs from this wonderful, magnificent show. So let's hear one of them now.
All you lovely listeners, thanks for joining us again. Welcome back.
If you're new here,
You've stumbled on our podcast,
or it's been recommended by a friend,
just sit back and relax,
We're coming to you from my mum's garage,
with crackers and cheese and a bottle of Pinot on the side. Our show has been described as the perfect marriage
of boozy jokes,
cheeky banter and in-depth chat about homicide. That's right, we're going to be telling you all about our favourite murders.
only not using that phrase.
Oh, yeah, that's right, that's already a thing. The show's about true crime. We're obsessed with murder. If it's sick, perverse or twisted, you know that we just can't resist it. We've done the reading, all the facts and figures. We plumb the depths of Wikipedia to research every vile misdeed for you. Decapitation and sex cult, mass suicide, stabbing,
Shooting,
hanging,
drowning,
poisoning with cyanide, strangulation and gouging out the eyes, psycho rapist cannibals who burn their victims alive. And yes,
if you're suffering with trauma,
these tales may cause distress. Turn off is not for you. but still nevertheless, consider this your trigger warning. From this point on, there's no turning back, no deviations, we're staying on track. The show that you're listening to is Kathy and Stella's Murder Podcast. We've got crimes for you. Kathy and Stella's Murder Podcast, every single one is true. The Murder Podcast with Kathy and Stella. Don't turn off, we got lots to tell you. Join us now, cause we're having a blast on Kathy and Stella's Murder Podcast.
But if you haven't heard us before, my name's Kathy.
And I'm Stella.
I work in a library.
And between jobs,
We're from Beverly near Hull.
you won't have heard of it. She's my best friend.
She's mine.
We went to school together.
We were fine.
She's the person that I call when things turn to shit.
We've always been a little bit obsessed with murder.
Not just the famous ones that everybody's heard of.
And though it's true, our audience is small.
So far, one day we'll show the world the best true crime podcast of them all is Kathy and Stella's Murder Podcast. But hey, by now you've probably got that. So let's read out some listener emails. Listener emails. Give us your feedback. We love to receive mail.
Ruthless92 says,
OMG, I love you. You are everything. Right back at you, mate.
Forensic Steve says,
Actually, I think you're fine.
Yeah, blah, blah, blah. We made a mistake.
Disrespectra says,
You should be ashamed using people's pain for your entertainment.
We know.
and Doomscroller sent us 7 DMs saying,
Cock and die, you fucking lesbians. And Nancy from listener emails. On Kathy and Stella's Murder Podcast, except no substitute. Kathy and Stella's Murder Podcast, the perfect length for your commute. You A to Z with Kathy and Stella, documenting every serial killer. Tales to shock and flabbergast, well researched and unbiased. Hit subscribe and do it fast to Kathy and Stella's Murder Podcast. Kathy and Stella's Podcast. Kathy and Stella's Podcast. Kathy and Stella's Murder Podcast.
My name is Matthew Floyd Jones, and I am the composer, co-lyricist, and musical director, and onstage pianist in Kathy and Stella Solve a Murder by John Britton and Matthew Floyd Jones, which is playing at the Painsplough Roundabout in Summerhall in Edinburgh for the Fringe 2022 at 9:50 every night.
Thank you. I think you've undersold yourself immediately because you've also missed out backing vocals.
Oh yeah, but I didn't want to do that. That's under duress because I would like more cast members, but as you've seen the show and people who would come to the show, it's a 5-person cast playing a multitude of characters in a very rollicking, play goes wrong Fringe way where, we're trying to do a huge show with a sort of a limited number of people, and so I always have to jump in on the piano to sing an extra harmony if I need it.
Well, it umps up the soundscape. But the
Yes.
soundscape is very impressive from the off. And actually, I'd like to start with that, if I may, because obviously you are the man behind the music
That's right,
from
yeah.
this fantastic show. And it's a fantastic show. And you were saying about doing a big show in limited resources. Well, that's the world, isn't it? Certainly
is
the Fringe.
the Fringe, yeah.
But you succeed in spades. I think it's a show that I would call is bigger than the show seems. And when you take it away afterwards, it's like an inflatable life raft in the sense that it seems in my head to have been in the West End. I have this sense of having seen it in the Palladium rather than in a sizable but circular tent.
That's fantastic,
In a
yeah.
playground, essentially. So.
Yeah.
And it's exuberant, so there's energy and power that comes all the way out of it. I found it. It was one of those shows. The moment you step into the room, you think, "I know this is going to be good." I can tell. There's a kind of sort of glow of a gloss of professional quality came out before any of the actors did. But I tell you, who was there before the actors? That's you, Matthew. So
that was just me then. I gave a professional sheen, did I?
You
Just
did.
sitting there.
you are a gloss.
Sure.
But actually, let's not undersell you, because what you were doing when we all came in, as we trooped in, because there was an enormous queue, there's a lot of people to seat, and they were doing that kind of, can everyone budge up so we can get everybody in,
Yeah.
proper sellout, was the fact that you were sitting at your, I'm going to call it piano, but I know it's a keyboard, and you were, it looked like you were extemporising music. You were obviously playing the hits from the show in a strange
Just
way.
playing a jammed overture, yeah.
Now, that's a great title. And it went on, of course, because obviously it took a while, because the shows in Edinburgh take the time they take to fill up.
Yeah.
So it's not strictly necessarily to the minute. So, but and I was looking at you, and there were a number of things I spotted. I first noticed that you weren't playing two music, and I thought, well, this is a man who knows the score intimately. And I thought, well, I wonder if he's written it. And of course, you had.
I did, yeah.
But also, you had command of the room even then, before the show started. So, I want to talk about the nuts and bolts of creating the show and how it came about. But I would like to start almost in parallel to how it was for me watching the show at the beginning with you.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're the first person in real terms before the audience comes in.
Yeah.
Do you feel any sort of weight of responsibility? How do you approach that? And is the jammed overture different every night?
Well, yeah, I think the reason it is a jammed overture as opposed to a more official, that I have a plan for it, not only, what you've just said about there isn't an absolute specific amount of time that it will take to seat everyone, so it does need to be flexible. But also, just to get this show up in the limited amount of time that we had, really. We had 4 weeks of rehearsal, which for Fringe isn't actually that difficult. That's quite luxurious for Fringe, but for a show of the scale that you've hinted at, where we're sort of trying to make a West End size show in a small tent, with the view to that it might end up somewhere.
Don't preempt my questions. No, I'm delighted. I'm genuinely delighted because it is a show that feels like it ought to go somewhere. But
and certainly that is the plan. So yeah, I think we're like exactly as you've picked up on. We wanted to write bigger and just be ambitious about it. But in order to do that, in the small amount of time that we had, and because we didn't really have a huge amount of development time before we rehearsed for Fringe, we had 1 week of a workshop, and then we just decided, we think we've got something here, we could just feel it, like you said, that energy and exuberance of it. We just thought, this is something, we have to do it this year. So we went straight into a rehearsal period of 4 weeks and then straight up here, and the time it took to get the actual show, not the pre-show, not the overture, nothing else about it, just the scenes and the songs of the show into where they are. They're still, we're still playing around with it. We're still every night, tomorrow we're going to, restage that way, or we're going to sort of swap that line for that line. But it just meant that it got to the first preview, and we'd always said, we'll probably have them walk in and I'll just sit at the piano because that's where I'll be during the show. I don't want to walk into the space in a kind of weird formal way. I'll be sat there already. So right. I don't want to bow and have floppy hair. So I just thought, well, I'll sit there anyway. And then obviously everyone said, well, do you just want to play, some music while they're coming in? And I thought, yeah, you know what? When it gets nearer the time, I'll figure out our overture, whatever that will be. And what has ended up happening is, obviously, rabbit headlights, it's happening now, we're about to do it. Of course I know the songs, because they're mine. But I just try and get from one to the other in a sort of backing me, I want it to feel not like an overture, obviously, because people are sitting and talking. It would be a very long overture, and I don't want people really listening to it. I just want it to. It's a mega. That's more what it is. Yeah. A kind of a bed of music.
But it is. You're right. There is that balance, because there's always the excited chat, isn't there, in the room,
which is
very much
essential.
Yeah. It really does build up an atmosphere, which is then not punctured but built upon. I don't know how you build upon an inflatable, but you get the idea. By the show. Can I ask? We've started on the overture, and I hope you won't mind, I'm going to dally there for a little bit longer. Mm-hmm. Have you discovered, from your own ad hoc jamming, which of the pieces go better together? Have you found any handbrake turns? You wish I really hadn't connected this song to that song, because Absolutely. That does not work.
Absolutely, yeah. I think if I had time, if I had even just a day to
might be
just
a song in this.
Sit down, yeah. If I could just decide the perfect flow, because that's the great thing about a true overture, and some overtures to shows, I think in their own rights are incredible. It's not just, here's a compilation of things to sort of wet your whistle as to what the score is going to be, but actually the overture itself, I'm thinking particularly of, have you ever heard of the show Crazy for You? It's a Gershwin show.
It's a jukebox musical, yes.
Right.
I believe it's coming back, isn't it?
I think it is, yes, I think
it was going on at
Chichester? It was in, I think, yes, I think it is at Chichester now, and there was a production recently in London. I loved it. We did Crazy for You at school. That was a school musical, a leading role I had at school. And I remember Crazy for You, for me, that overture is, because it's Gershwin and because it's all those, the way that flows, it's its own, it's almost like an orchestral piece of music. It could be. You could play that in a prom, and I think it would completely sit alongside.
Well, Gershwin lends itself to that.
Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And I sort of feel like that to me, and I love the Mac and Mabel overture, which is Jerry Herman, and I
like you a lot.
Well, there are shades of Jerry Herman in Kathy and Stella, I would say, because I love. I'm not sure if I'd say he's my favourite. He's up there. He's top 3 for me.
Well, yeah, your taste is also impeccable.
Sure.
In a terrible, terrible name drop, and here it comes. I've interviewed him when obviously before. Yeah.
Did you?
About 2007 and
Is
8.
he still alive?
No, passed away a few years ago. Great pity. But I tell you what, he was a very enthusiastic man, even at his venerable age when I interviewed him.
I love that.
No staircase, I noticed, however, because there can't be in the tent. If you really want those Jerry Herman, the feelings.
Felicia Taylor walking down the staircase in a big dress.
It would work.
Yeah, we've got about 5 steps either side, so it's not quite as impressive as Carol Channing.
And if she sort of wobbles down a step ladder, it just doesn't have the same effect.
It would be funny. It'd be very fringe dolly. Yeah.
Oh no, God, yeah, now you're giving me ideas.
Yeah.
So, but you found some bits and pieces which do flow. So, yeah, I mean, you're right. The art of creating a good overture is overlooked, because when it works, it really hits the spot. And as you say, it has the power to build a sense of tension. It does more than just give you a sense of what the highlights of the melodies are going to be. When done well, exactly right. And you do, people do rewrite overtures as well. I mean, I'm going back further to Gilbert and Sullivan, but my favourite, Rudiger, has the original overture, and then it has the rewrite. Because it's one of the shows that's always developed over the years, because they've tweaked it. Well after Gilbert and Sullivan were dead, they've still continued to tweak it in the 20s. Yeah. Brand new overture. And then you suddenly realise the earlier one is probably rather better, in my opinion. But,
yeah, exactly.
But actually, it's so interesting to have 2 overtures of the same piece to allow you to do that compare and contrast, which you don't often get.
Yeah.
But once again, I think you're underselling yourself, if you don't mind me saying, Matthew, because there are, you've made it sound as though you're playing a kind of, I think you used the word bed, a kind of bed almost for conversation and sort of to let it filter into the noggin. Yeah. But I think you're doing much more than that, or certainly, to me, you were playing with passion. No, I wouldn't expect you not to, but I've been to shows, and I'm sure you've been to shows where, certainly smaller shows, fringe shows, where someone will come along and play the overture or the entr'acte or whatever it's going to be, and it's a little bit plinky plonky.
Yes,
and you're not plinky. You are not plinky plonky.
I don't like to plink or plonk. I like to play.
I'm going to write that.
I never plink or plonk knowingly. Yes, well, that's great. I mean, I guess maybe that is because I feel like I never sit at the piano and the performance is happening somewhere else, because my experience of everything I've done really is usually that I am a visible and active piano player in the space, as opposed to someone you shouldn't be looking at. I mean, this is the first time really that I'm I'm not really a character in something. Usually I would actually be involved. Although I know there is one moment in Kathy and Stella where it seems I might become involved, but it's just a trick.
A beautiful moment though.
Was no one like me till the day that I met you.
I hated pretty much everyone till I found someone who hated everyone too.
Other friends may share a bond, but no one else.
No one else compares to us.
'Cause I know that not a single one of them
has found someone who saw the one for them.
And if I didn't have you, I would die. If I didn't have you, I don't know how I could even get dressed in the morning or do anything at all. No reason to try, 'cause without you I'd die.
Thanks, mate. If I didn't have you, I would also die. If I didn't have you, no other best friends need apply. You're completely irreplaceable. I'm never gonna give you up, just like Rick Astley. You mean too much to me. Who would I share my stupid thoughts with? Until I snort with.
We're meant to be, and that you can't deny.
We're codependent.
Oh, tell me, how would I keep going? Why would my blood continue flowing when losing you would make me want to die?
If I didn't have you, I would die.
If I didn't have you, I would actually,
genuinely.
If I didn't have you, I'd be terrified.
If I didn't have you,
I'd just run away and hide. I'd curl up in a little ball and disappear from view. That's what I do. I do that too. And that's why without you I would die.
And what a treat that was. So there we are. You've just heard another song from Cathy and Stella Solve a Murder, and that was called If I Didn't Have You, I Would Die. And of course, before the interview extract, you heard Cathy and Stella's Murder podcast. And my enormous thanks to Matthew and everyone at Francesca Moody Productions for allowing me to play those songs in this episode. The book and the lyrics were by John Britton. The music and lyrics were by Matthew Floyd-Jones, and the vocals were by Bronte Barbe, who was Cathy, Rebecca Hines, who was Stella, Jodie Jacobs, TJ Lloyd, and Imelda Warren Green. The recording, mixing and mastering was by Alvin Lee Ryan at Juno Studios, and the producers were Francesca Moody Productions and Cater Gordon. And of course, in the middle of those songs, you heard an extract from a fantastic conversation with the wonderful Matthew Floyd-Jones. And I'm very eager for you to hear the rest of that fab conversation. That's his description, and one I absolutely subscribe to. We had a marvellous time having a long, in-depth chat about this 5-star pick of the fringe musical, Cathy and Stella Solve a Murder. And it's on at the Roundhouse at Summer Hall. And there are performances of that show until the 28th of August, excepting the 23rd. Now, I should say that I believe they have probably sold out, but it is worth checking to see if there's any returns, or if any extra shows have been added, as some already have been. And if you don't get a chance to see this in Edinburgh, let's all hope that it goes somewhere else. As Matthew said, there is some intention that there should be, so that we can see it somewhere else. It's a great, great musical. Cathy and Stella Solve a Murder, 5 stars. And the Musical Talk Pick of the Fringe, 2022. Now, that show, of course, is at the cutting edge of the latest contemporary musical theatre here in Britain. It's a brand new show, and hopefully is going to go many places further. But of course, musicals in all their forms have a long history, and it's always good to have an opportunity to celebrate them. And there was a show in Edinburgh that did precisely this for one of the great names of musical film from the 1930s. The title of the piece is Ingenue. Deanna Durbin, Judy Garland and the Golden Age of Hollywood. And that title tells you everything about this one-woman show put on by Melanie Gall. And it was a show I absolutely loved. But what was it about? That's a terribly good question, so let's go once again to the Ed Fringe website to explain. Judy Garland is an icon, loved as Dorothy in Oz, but in the 1930s, Deanna Durbin was a much bigger star. Ingenue tells the true, forgotten tale of the lifelong friendship and rivalry between these two old Hollywood idols. Now, it's true that Deanna Durbin only has limited resonance these days for people who know their musical theatre and musical film. Her heyday was definitely the 1930s and the early part of the 1940s, and she then went into retirement. But there is a generation of people for whom Deanna Durbin was truly a wonderful Hollywood musical film star. One of my own relatives, my great aunt, always used to say that Deanna Durbin was her favourite film star across all the genre. And whilst she is essentially the Greta Garbo of musical films, she was an enormous star in her day. So, let's hear an excerpt of the conversation I had with Melanie Gall about this wonderful show, Ingenue. And in this section, you'll hear us talking about Deanna Durbin's songs and her songbook legacy from the golden age of Hollywood. Musical talk. So it's not actually as though you knew of her, but you didn't actually sort of live and dream and think about her all the time in your youth. Is she someone you've come to?
I mean, I hope
almost?
my youth isn't totally over.
I meant your
Yes.
juvenile youth.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, because of the books, yes, but it was only that one movie. That was the one movie I had seen. I had seen Three Smart Girls. I knew the music from the movie, but no, I hadn't seen her other films because they just weren't available. You couldn't just go onto eBay and order them. There was no eBay.
No, of course, no. It's a very different world, wasn't it?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, if it wasn't in Blockbuster,
Yeah.
you couldn't rent it. So I wasn't able to get her movie. So I knew of her. I knew what she looked like. I did not know that much about her.
Well, I must say, apart from the fact my great aunt, I should say, was keen, I also didn't know too much about her, but I did know some of the music. And actually, I think we should talk about your piece, if I may, because
sure.
you have several songs in there. And I was surprised by how many I knew. So it's foolish, but it's fun. I would call it a light 1930s ditty, really.
It is. I mean, it's from Mad About Music, and she doesn't sing that alone, really. I mean, everyone's riding their little bikes and singing it together. No, that's I Love to Whistle. What movie is that from? I should know this. No, I think that's also from there.
It's perfectly possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's been... I'm very jet lagged. But no, that I Love to Whistle, they were on bicycles. It's foolish. Someone's going to know. And I'm sorry, I just blanked on this.
But I'll tell you what was interesting to me. I'd heard it on the radio here in the United Kingdom.
Really?
Yes, because up until recently, we had several slightly elderly DJs on the BBC Radio 2, which was the kind of station that was going to play that. And we had David Jacobs and we had Desmond Carrington. And I know for a fact that Desmond Carrington played Deanna Durbin songs, and I knew that from there.
Oh,
so
lovely.
as late as... Well, he literally died about 5 years ago. So I would say certainly in the last 10 or so years, Deanna Durbin has been played on the radio here.
Good.
Yes, and there's always been, I wouldn't say it's widespread, but there's always a group of people who were very keen on the pre-war music. I am one of them. And
Me
so
too.
I picked up quite a lot of songs. So I also knew Round and Round the Turntable Goes, which I think is a 1940s number.
Yes, yeah, that is... The story behind that is very interesting because in the movie that featured that, they actually made a society of DJs and they flew a bunch of DJs in to do a promotional stunt for the movie, because in the movie she plays a DJ, and these DJs realized when they got there that there wasn't a society of DJs, that they were just being flown in to promote a movie, and they formed their own.
So it created...
They created their own society of DJs from this movie promotion event. So
fact followed fiction in a strange way.
Exactly, and that was around for quite a while. I mean, it's segued into something else now, but yeah, that I think was the National Association of Radio DJs or something like that.
The one thing I will say about that particular song is it's got quite the hook, because I did know it. Once again, Desmond Carrington and David Jacobs will have played it, and you sang it, and it's now 2 or 3 days since I saw your show, and it keeps lurking in the back of my mind. And bearing in mind I see almost exclusively musicals up here, that's quite interesting to me, but it has such staying power.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's a compliment, I think.
It is. Oh, it is.
I am your earworm.
Well, yes, I mean, that's exactly right. But what it also goes to show is, I think, the quality of the songs that she was singing.
Yes.
And it's interesting, isn't it, sadly, that I suspect with her eclipsing her own popularity, if you like, removing herself from the public scene, being, if you like, the musical Greta Garbo.
Right.
Some of her music has got lost with her. Because her records haven't lived on in the same way that her reputation hasn't lived on. Whereas, for example, Judy Garland, her songs and her back catalogue are always being performed and mined, including some of the more minor songs, just because there's still a kind of sort of light burning in that legacy, if that makes sense.
Right. And it's interesting. That is a very good point. And another point is a lot of these songs weren't covered by a lot of other people. I mean, a lot of them are American songbooks, essentially what would have been standards if more people had sung them. But more people didn't sing them. This is the thing. And I mean, for example, one song, and it's not in my show, it's the song More and More, and people do sing that quite a lot, but she made it so famous at one point that Frank Sinatra wrote her a letter and said, I was going to sing it, I'm not singing it now because people want to hear less and less of me and more of you.
Well, nice line.
Yeah, I know, I was like, that's lovely, but this is why, the major singer, I mean, he did end up singing it, but still, the people who kept the American songbook songs going often didn't sing her songs.
Now that's really interesting. And is that because she was such a personality singer, would you say? Because there are some people who sing songs and other people don't cover them, exactly as you said. I'm trying to think why that would be, because One of the songs you do sing in your show is from The Wizard of Oz, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, of course. And that's been covered a million times, even though obviously the Judy Garland one is going to be the one that lives forever, like Bing Crosby and White Christmas. There are certain songs associated with people, but they escape.
But was Somewhere Over the Rainbow covered at the time? I don't know that it was.
No, I think you might be right.
This is the thing. So these weren't being covered for the most part. Vera Lynn sang... She sang "Say a Prayer for the Boys Over There," so that was. But again, that was Britain.
Yeah, that would have played with our hit parade, as it were.
Well, exactly. But Vera Lynn she was equally as famous at that point, But here, so, but for the most part, if no one would be able to compare, they weren't going to be singing those songs, and then if these songs are forgotten, they never would have been covered later, like "Somewhere Over the Rainbow" was so many times.
That's it. It's genuinely interesting, because I'm also wondering if there's a gender thing going on, because actually when I think back to the Great American Songbook, it's quite often songs which were introduced by Fred Astaire or Bing Crosby, and I just wonder, Fred Astaire's marvellous, and I love Fred Astaire,
so do I.
But his voice is what you would call a very affable voice.
That's a good way to put it. He was very affable.
But you can also imagine how that song could then be sung by somebody else, whereas if Deanna Durbin has this sort of character and a reputation and a position. Also, she's thought of as being a singer, whereas Fred Astaire is a singer. I think of him as a singer, but most people think of him as a dancer, of course. So I wonder if it's also I wonder if songs escape more easily from some performers than others.
Also, she was very young when she sang some of these. So if you're say an adult male singing with a big band, are you going to cover the song that a 13-year-old made famous? You don't want to be compared unfavorably to a child.
Teeny bopper.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So
there is something in that, of course. Yeah. Because she, and you've alluded on this already, because she is instrumental in creating what might be called the first phase of teen culture.
Oh, for sure.
We think of Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney, and of course they were all contemporaries, and they knew each other, as you quite rightly explain in your show. But she was right there, and would be remembered as such if she hadn't sort of gone into retirement, as it were.
Exactly, but even the series of Mickey Rooney movies, those were made after Deanna became famous. Just a couple of years, but she established the teenage superstar. And then, Mickey Rooney was under contract to MGM at the time. He was. But they weren't starring him in things. And then all of a sudden he made the Andy Hardy series. But again, she had already established the role of a teenage protagonist at that point.
Interesting. And that was in the 30s?
That was 1936.
Isn't that interesting?
And same with Jackie Cooper. He was acting, but he wasn't the teenage protagonist. He was in her fourth movie, I believe.
Oh, right, okay.
With her. And then he went on.
But she was there first, that's the point.
She was. Yeah. They were maybe there first, but she established the fact that a teenager could basically hold a movie. That certain age. That was the movie he was in with her. Good
name under the circumstances, isn't it?
Well, exactly.
Because I'm also thinking, the Archie comics, for example, are not that popular here in the United Kingdom, but I know they came into being in 1942, which is only, say, 5 or 6 years after this phase of filmmaking. So
I did not know the date, but that makes sense.
Very much a response to that. Well, he was originally envisaged as being the cartoon version of Andy Hardy.
I didn't know that. Yeah, so if you think about it, it's the same.
Very
it's
obvious.
The same idea.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we've established Deanna Durbin, and I'm sure we'll get back to her. But let's talk about your version of her songs and your piece. So you decided you were going to do it, and you've got experience of doing these shows with famous singers, male and female, I noticed. But so how do you put them together? That piece of blank paper, that most threatening of things in any creative world. How do you attack it?
You start with the songs. So basically, I pick the songs I like. I picked the songs that have to be in the show. Over the Rainbow had to be in there. It's a Judy Garland song. People expect it. So that, you pick the songs that have to be in, you pick the songs you want to be in, and then you sort of look thematically. When were the songs written in the career? What are the songs sort of about? Where could they fit in? And then you sort of work in the important parts of their life. The first time I have a few actually different Edith Piaf shows. And the first time I did a Piaf show was one of the first shows I ever wrote. I didn't know that much about her life, but I certainly felt I did. So I had a couple little highlight
You had the
bits.
courage of your convictions.
Well, this is the thing. The more you know, the less confident you are in what you know. So, I had a few stories that may or may not be true. It's been 12 years now. I don't, who knows?
Research may have moved on.
Yeah, something like that. Maybe her past changed. But so I was very confident that I gave a good overview of her life just by saying these very, separated by quite a lot of time, tiny stories. And I'm like, there we go, that's her life. But when you actually research someone's life properly, which I have grown to do over the years, you think, okay, what can I leave out? And there's very little you feel you can leave out.
It's harder and harder, I bet, isn't it? Yes, because you want to do justice to the person.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah. You're essentially deciding how history is presented, and this might be the only time. And this is a person you've never met. I've never met her. I respect what she does, but also I've never met her. I mean, it's someone I will never meet, and I am the one deciding how and same with the book, deciding how their history will be preserved, and that's kind of a lot of responsibility.
Well, you're the ambassador of their legacy in a strange way.
That's a good way to put it.
Musical talk. And that was Melanie Gall talking about her fabulous show, Ingenue. Deanna Durbin, Judy Garland and the Golden Age of Hollywood. And if you want to know how good her research was for that show, I can tell you that Melanie is also the author of Deanna Durbin's biography, out this year. And that show, well, it was a 4-star show and a sparkling delight. And if you want to go and see it, of course you can, because it's on at the Space at Surgeons Hall up until Saturday the 27th of August. And it's well worth seeing. Well, moving on to a very different show now, or rather 2 very different shows, because there were 2 musicals by the same theatrical company called Goya, which you could have seen, and indeed still can see, at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, called Don't Say Macbeth and Sex with Friends and Other Tiny Catastrophes. And it's always interesting to see 2 new pieces of work, staged by the same company, and with a significant overlap in the performers, a kind of repertory company, if you will. Now, Don't Say Macbeth is a comedy musical, whereas Sex with Friends and Other Tiny Catastrophes is more serious, although certainly has light-hearted moments. But I think putting on 2 shows of such different tones might be quite a challenge. And so I sat down with the 2 composers for those shows, that's Sam Woof and Math Roberts, to talk about the challenge of putting on 2 shows at the same time and the differing nature of those 2 different productions. So, let's hear from Sam and Math. Musical talk.
I'm Sam Woof, and I am the writer and composer of Sex with Friends, which is playing this month at the Edinburgh Festival at the Pleasance. And I will hand now over to my writing partner on Don't Say Macbeth, which is another show which is playing, and you will introduce yourself.
I will. I'm Math Roberts, and I am a writer, composer, musical director, and I am the musical director for both our shows, so Sex with Friends, and also musical director and co-writer of the music and lyrics for Don't Say Macbeth, which is playing at the Edinburgh Fringe at Zoo Playground 2 every day as well.
Now, I think one of the things that's interesting, these shows are great, by the way, they're both great, they're tonally very different, they're trying to do very different things, but actually I want to ask you a logistics question first, which is why did you bring 2 fabulous but 2 challenging shows to the Edinburgh Fringe? Because that seems to me quite a lot, that's quite a mouthful, and not only that, you're in 2 different venues.
Yes.
So it's sort of, can I ask, was the plan always to bring up 2? Or is it a plan that then developed, hence the fact you're at 2 different venues? What's the history? How do these two things come to the Edinburgh Fringe? And I mean, you manage them magnificently, but that is a big challenge. When did you realise the challenge was upon you?
So I think Sex with Friends has always been a show that Goya wanted to bring up, and then I think when we decided that we were going to write Don't Say Macbeth as a concept, we thought it just worked well as 2 rep company shows, I think.
So Goya, to explain, is the theatre company that I set up at uni, and this is our first Fringe out of uni. So
is it really? Which university are you with, by the way?
We were at Oxford.
Very good.
Yes, the heart of the establishment. If it's any consolation, I had a terrible time. But I did.
It's no consolation at all.
Found a theatre company, and Goya is that company. And Sex with Friends, we'd actually developed in coordination with the North Wall, which is a theatre in Oxford, who've been really supportive of us. And it was through them that we got in touch with Pleasance, and it was sort of bound to come for some time. It went on in the North Wall, so it's had a couple of runs beforehand. So this is its sort of second proper iteration.
Oh right, so it's honed already, as it were.
It's had some, it was initially an hour and a half piece, which came down to an hour long for the Fringe, which basically meant cutting rather a lot of the middle eights. And so, that's been reduced and brought, and that was always going to come. And then we were writing another show, which was going to be a sort of, it was basically going to be a take on Macbeth, but set in a fashion house. which is going to be very camp and silly. If
As
anyone
opposed to
steals
the-
that idea, I will be absolutely furious.
As opposed to the very serious take on Macbeth you've actually brought.
Very serious, very
Quite amazing,
serious.
Yeah.
In any case, we were desperately attempting to write this musical and hitting a brick wall, and so that took the form of us messing around with musical theatre tropes and getting quite drunk in a pub in Rotherhithe one evening, which culminated in us deciding to write a show called Don't Say Macbeth, which is basically about it sort of Noises Off meets musical theatre. So it's about a group of performers and a director desperately trying to put on a version of Macbeth, a sort of feminist reclamation of Macbeth, which goes terribly wrong as it goes on.
And increasingly so, and with a sort of delightful cartoony flavour as well. In fact, almost literally in some senses.
Yes.
Yes, no, I like the unravelling. It's I suppose it's sort of performers disassemble if Marvel ever got their hands on it. So, should we just briefly then describe the two shows? Because I did say they're totally very different, both terribly successful. I think you've more or less explained Don't Say Macbeth, although we will come back to it. You've mentioned Sex with Friends. It does have a rather magnificent subtitle.
It does.
Which is?
So it's called Sex with Friends and Other Tiny Catastrophes.
And that microcosm concept of a group of friends is, well, it's been done in lots of other versions. We'll talk about that, I'm sure. But actually, it's a good pool in which to fish. Would you mind just briefly, without too many spoilers, explaining the sort of the cut and thrust of the narrative there?
We'll probably be quite good at this as a pitch on the mile. Is something we have to do in about 5 seconds anyway. So.
You can give me a flyer if you want.
Yes, so Sex with Friends and Other Tiny Catastrophes is about 6 friends graduating from university and negotiating their early 20s. In essence, it's a sort of rom-com, I think, about them falling in love and falling apart. And it's about a group of people coming together as a friend group that they desperately want to be a family, or sort of family structure, and yet, as we see over the course of the show, it gradually falls apart as people grow in very different directions and have sex with each other and then fall out and sleep with all the wrong people and say all the wrong things. So yeah, it's a kind of, it came from me looking at Friends, not the television show, but actually the phenomenon of Friends.
A group of friends.
Yeah, a group of friends, and trying to figure out what it is to be in a group of friends in that sort of structure that I never quite understood, and watching them form around me at uni. And yeah, sort of deep fascination and slight distrust of what friends are and how they function, and I think that's where it came from. But it functions as a really light, kind of champagne, bubbly piece about a group of people in their 20s trying to make their way.
You say that, but I'm going to suggest that actually there's a few more truths in it than just, it's not a throwaway. I'm going to make a contrast. There's another show up here I'm not going to name that does something rather similar. We've both seen that as well. And it actually, funny enough, you finish, I think, on New Year's Eve. Other times in the year are also there. Similar constructs are available in this other show. The other show is enjoyable, but I think yours is the better. And the reason I think yours is the better personally is because I think it's got a little bit more light and shade in it, actually, amongst other things. I'm not here to criticise the other show at all, and it would be wrong of me to do so, but it is, 6 or 8 or 12, however many friends, and the dynamics, the social dynamics and the complications and catastrophes of sexual liaison within a group of friends is actually an ultimately fascinating, probably an ultimately kaleidoscopic set of options. So you have to have made a decision somewhere, and I'm very interested to know what your creative process is here, on how do you approach that? Because it's interesting that you say it's not so much semi-biographical, but from observation of life. Or maybe it is semi-biographical, but yes. I believe the words "your witness, Your Honour" is what comes up here. I know you, but actually, you can do it light, you can do it layered, you can do it seriously. You could have made this Wagnerian. I'm glad you didn't. And also the combinations. How did you map out your narrative first?
Yes.
And there will be a very similar question in relation to Macbeth.
Yeah.
Well, I decided on 3 chapters. The first of which is a housewarming. It's all structured in one apartment, which is the apartment of Mel. who I think was my first character, and she is desperately trying to hold this friend group together. She's come from a
She's
sort
the most motherly of them in a way, isn't she? In the broadest, most positive sense of that term.
Yes, absolutely. She's the core. She's the centre.
Yeah.
She is the planet around which everything else revolves.
But also slightly overlooked by her friends, if I may say.
Yes,
Yeah.
she is cruelly.
Yes, I
overlooked.
mean, I really felt for... I mean, forgive me, we're already getting onto the emotional responses, but I really felt for her, particularly at the end, because she's worked so hard to keep this group together, and despite her best ambitions, it hasn't. But also, they haven't necessarily always been fabulous friends to her, or they've taken her for granted. I thought hers was the greatest tragedy in the thing, in a way, from my own personal emotional response. But please do carry on. I'm so sorry.
Yes, so no, 3 chapters. The first is a housewarming where we meet the characters. The second is a birthday party where the characters sort of begin to fall in love with each other, and it becomes drunken and chaotic. And the third
I'm told one often begets the other. So.
And the third is an episode of real difficulty. I think we sit in a kind of awkwardness. They all cancel on a holiday they were supposed to go on, which is an important beat in the piece, because Mel has organised this holiday, and these young people desperately trying to make their own way in the world cancel for various different reasons, and they reunite some months later, and it's been some time, and new relationships have formed, but really the essence of the friend group has been compromised, and so there is a great difficulty in this new dynamic, and we're left at the end of the piece with a question about whether they'll remain friends or not.
And the nature of that friendship, by which I mean, funnily enough, I agree with you, because my personal take, and you can tell me I'm wrong, but certainly I would have argued that as a group they are finished, but as the individual parts of that group, some of those friendship couplings and beyond will survive, which of course is actually the experience of so many of us after leaving university and beyond. But actually, there's so much more group, from school to university to flat sharing. People sort of live in groups and then suddenly they don't. I can tell you from my exalted old age, but there was a lot of truth in your in your piece. Just to flip this, and we will keep flipping back and forth, how did the narrative for Don't Say Macbeth come to be?
Well, we went away, didn't we, for a week? So I'm from North Wales, and we went back to my home there for a week in order to form this story.
Oh, you actually had a writing week?
Yeah, we had a little
what a
retreat.
privilege.
Who did we think we were, really? We went away, yeah.
Well, Noel Coward used to do it on a cruise to New York, so yours is slightly cheaper.
And it wasn't secluded either. We didn't turn off our phones or anything. But no, we went away, and we wanted to come back, I think, after that week with a fully formed idea in order to tell ourselves that this is an idea that we can bring to the Fringe. And we went away and we plodded through, fleshed out some characters that we thought were funny, and I think we just had a laugh for a week, really, and threw things at the wall and see if they stuck, and edited out and all that sort of stuff. But I think we probably started officially with the songs. I think we figured out, one of the conversations we had in that bar in Rotherhithe was where can we fit songs into this idea of seeing a company of players prepare for a show. And obviously we can see them in the show itself, the showing of the show, but then how do we feed that into the rehearsal process was an interesting question. And so obviously
this is the shown rehearsal process.
It's the show,
because
yes.
we see the rehearsals building up to the first night.
Yeah, so the first 2 acts of the show is this kind of build up, big old wheel turning into, is this show going to finally happen? And of course it does, and it all falls apart, but it's how we see those songs in that rehearsal process in the show itself. It's all very meta, and then we've noted down quite a lot of different places that songs could appear, and then we decided that they would be comedy songs. And then,
can I say the excitement as you say comedy songs? I really think I heard it there. You said comedy songs.
Comedy songs. yeah.
Serious songs.
Yeah. You need the lightheartedness after Sex with Friends, I think. We decided as we were writing that maybe what we needed to do was pay homage, if you will, to the songs that exist in musical theatre already. And so that was a lot of fun for us to play around with that and see how many little musical nods we can get into all of these different numbers.
There we are, an extract of the conversation I had with Math Roberts and Sam Woof about their 2 musicals, Don't Say Macbeth and Sex with Friends and Other Tiny Catastrophes. Each show was a 4-star show and well worth seeing. And of course you can see them because at the time of broadcast of this episode there is still availability for both. So if you want to see Don't Say Macbeth, You can see that at Zoo Playground, which is at the end of Infirmary Street, near Chambers Street, and that's on every day until Saturday the 28th of August, with the exception of the 24th. And those dates are exactly the same for Sex with Friends and Other Tiny Catastrophes, but the venue for that is the Pleasance Courtyard. Both shows are great, and if you see one, you'll have a wonderful time, but if you see both, your day will be made. Talking of having one's day made, let's now talk about the next show. And if you're a regular listener to Musical Talk, the name Colour Inside the Lines might ring a bell with you. And it certainly should, because it was a show which was available virtually at last year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. A one-woman show featuring and written by Jenny Stafford. It was superb, and both me and Mike Shapiro adored it when we watched the video. So you can imagine my delight when I saw that Jenny was bringing that show to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this year, live and in person. I absolutely made that one of my must-sees for the year, and seeing it in person was fabulous and a real privilege. But nothing compared to the privilege of being able to sit down with Jenny afterwards to talk about her fabulous show. So in a minute we'll hear a 10-minute extract from the conversation I had with Jenny about her show, Colour Inside the Lines, when we talk about how songs are created and the nature of boundaries in narrative telling and where sensitivity really needs to be considered. In addition to being creative, Jenny is very thoughtful, and that came out in spades in both the performance and in that conversation. But beforehand, and indeed afterwards, Jenny has very kindly let us play 2 songs from her wonderful show. After the conversation, you'll hear a song which is the title song, Colour Inside the Lines and Erase. But before, let's hear a song called The Home of the Losers. And these are 2 live recordings made especially for Musical Talk from one of the recent performances at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe.
Is that even here, in the home of the losers, there is a hierarchy. At the top you have your Shawns and Kellys playing all the leading roles. They're kind of hot, but just for theater. Watch as they achieve your goals. Your Cinderellas and your princes, presidents of drama club. You want to hate them, but you also want to be them. That's the rub. 'Cause they're the top of the home of the losers. Come and join me in the middle. We have skills, we're always cast, but always as the mom or friend, 'cause we look old or tall or fat. In drama club, I'm secretary. That role fits me like a glove. We play the parts that reinforce that we are never finding love. In the middle of the home of the losers. See, in high school, it's very important to know who's inferior. 'Cause when you're a loser, God, it's nice to feel superior. Even if you're playing Sister Margareta and not Mother Superior. It's fine. It's been 20 years. I'm not bitter. Yes, I am. There's ensemble. They can't really sing or dance, and maybe they could play the lead, but do you want to take the chance? No. Still, they're like in each production. They are staples in the show. Is that one Becky or Melissa? Oh, it's Michael? God, who knows? 'Cause they're the bottom of the home of the losers. Welcome to the home of the losers. Now you're in the home of the losers.
We were talking therefore about these songs and the nexus points. So
then it was sort of going through and figuring out which of these parts of the story would be most clearly communicated in song. And there were some that felt fairly obvious to me the moment of like seeing him in the wings of the high school and like wondering like, is this the person that I should be with? Am I judging too quickly? That one felt very immediately like a song. The ones, I don't know if we want to do spoilers on this or not.
Well, I'd like to, but a little bit later perhaps.
Oh, great.
So let's just
then there's some other songs that after the spoiler moment that felt quite naturally like that. And then there were some that came a little bit later. The first song, The Home of the Losers, sort of explaining the hierarchy of the high school drama club, came a little bit later. It was like, I feel like we need some kind of like introduction to the world kind of song. And the very first, the drag queen reading my palm, like almost functions like an I Want song, not 100%, but like enough, I think, to sort of like fill that space in a musical where it would normally be.
Am I going to get song?
Yes.
Or not? Yes, quite. But also, I've said it before, it's that really striking opening. You know, when you're an audience member, you sit there, you come out on the stage, you sit on your circular stool, and you start with this preposterous line, but sort of lovably preposterous as well, you know, because actually it absolutely could happen, you know. Here we are in Edinburgh. I bumped into more than my fair share of drag queens, and they're funny people.
Oh, yes.
In all the senses, but they are, you know, they're easily believable as pseudo fortune tellers. But it's such a good line. You know, you hook us in right at the beginning, and then, of course, your storytelling is so humane. Was it hard to keep a handle on the humanity, by which I mean, obviously the story is so much your story, it's a long history of your life in some senses, but when one is writing, one has to finesse slightly, one has to tidy things up just for coherence. And also you can find yourself going down a particular line thinking, oh, this is exciting, or where's this going to take me? And then you get to the end of that line, you've really enjoyed writing it or creating it, and you think, it's not actually germane to the plot, or this is self-indulgent, or, well, you know, I'm not saying there's any of that in the show, but, you know, but the writing process can take you in a lot of places. And the secret of writing, well, one of the secrets of writing well, is to be able to row back. Did you have any issues on that?
I would say really the biggest challenge with that is because this is a true story, and because so much of that story is about someone else who was a real person who lived, that I knew, that I would like to honor and elevate and honor his legacy. I would say a difficult, challenging part of this piece was figuring out how much of that is my story to tell and how much of that is not my story to tell. And knowing that, you know, for all I know, like, his family could see this show, people who care about him could see this show, and how do I talk about him and talk about this moment and talk about, you know, what happened in the rest of his life in a way that doesn't overstep my bounds and is sensitive to him and to people who cared about him.
Well, from my vantage point, and obviously I have no connection with you or the character Michael, whom we're discussing, but I think you trod the line very delicately and just right.
Thank you.
As we said in a previous episode, there's a biographical fact, quite a significant one, which is factually out there, but the things relating to it, which natural curiosity makes one think about, because we're all human, and humans are good and bad, and in the middle, and curious beasts. But actually, you make the right decision on not revealing more than is necessary, I think. So I think it's tastefully done as well. I think, once again, though, it comes back to the word humane, because actually that is a humane consideration, which I suspect not all creators would necessarily have followed quite so tastefully.
I felt very fortunate. I worked with dramaturg Sarah Johnson, that I've worked with quite a few times, and that was a conversation that we had a lot, was how to handle this material, and sort of coming around to, like, that ultimately the story has to be about me, because I am able to tell my own story. I do have the agency to tell that. I don't have the agency to tell his story. So it has to ultimately be about the intertwining of our stories and what did I learn from having interacted with him.
Where the paths take you and where they take you away, and where they may take you again in other forms and places and times.
Yes,
it's human connections. There are some other shows up here in Edinburgh this year, I'm not going to name, where actually there's been quite a lot of manipulation, where a presumably genuine story has been revealed by the actor or actress, and it's that balance between truth and manipulation. You can reveal something in an aimed way, but you can also reveal something in a self-indulgent or greedy way, and I've seen it done, you know, revelation followed by requirement for validation. And actually, I don't think there's any of that in your show. I hope you don't mind I'm going to validate you, as if that were my place to do. But what I mean is the show is great, but it's so perfectly pitched. I didn't feel manipulated at all. And we will talk about a particular issue in a minute, which is going to be after our spoiler moment, or spoiler barrier. But so let's get back to the songs. Yeah. So I think they're beautiful. I think they are. They do exactly what we've already discussed, that they push the story forward, but they're each individual and each interesting. colour inside the lines and erase. I mean, it's the name of the show, so it's nice to know there is a song with that title. But it's a much more complex song than I think people think, because it's got moments where you have to speak and elaborate some of the detail within it, so it's part of a drama.
Yes.
It's not a song per se, it is a method by which the drama is pursued. It's a method by which the narrative is pushed.
Yes.
It just happens to be a song, but it's more than a song, it intertwines within, and also it goes off in different directions, so it's not a simple song, and yet it sounds like a simple song. So we're back to my original position. But that's craft. That's absolutely, in my opinion, that's craft.
Thank you.
Did you find the songs, it's sort of the same question again, but having identified where the songs were going to go and what they were going to be about and how they might do it, is it then easy to write a song for you? Or is it actually the process of writing a song that helps you see how you're going to do it?
That's a great question, and I think it's both.
That's a great answer. Tell me why.
I think I generally go into a song sort of knowing, like, okay, here's what I want this song to accomplish, here's where I want it to start. By the end of it, here's where I want to have landed, and I have sort of a general idea of, like, probably what's going to happen in the middle and how we'll get there. And then, I don't know, sort of that process of making art where it reveals itself to you, where you're like, oh, I thought it was going to be this, but actually now that I'm into it, like, it might be funnier to take it this direction, or actually I think we're going to need more information over here. So I think a lot of the songs were like that, where I sort of started with an idea of what I thought it was going to be, and then they revealed themselves through the process of the writing. And I was really fortunate. Like I said, I don't always consider myself to be a composer, but I worked with my guitarist, Mark, who is also my fiance.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
Was it the gentleman we saw on stage?
That's him.
Oh, you looked like a lovely couple already.
Oh, I thank you.
And he smiled a lot all the way through.
Oh, well, I pay him for that. But he's a really excellent guitarist and a really excellent musician. And so there were a lot of times when I was like, cool, I want it to sound like, and he's like, oh yeah. And then he can make
Just
that
do
happen.
it.
And then he can, like, add his own little embellishments to it. So he was like a really wonderful arranger on this piece too. So a lot of the songs still felt collaborative in a way, even though I was writing the bulk of it.
But art is collaborative, or the best art is collaborative,
Yes,
isn't it?
absolutely.
This is not the kind of thing I'd normally do. This is not the girl I want to be. But if I can change my fate with just a number 2 pencil, then why not take a chance? I mean, let's see. 'Cause this is just step 1 in a longer game. A date for this dance, then a date for prom. If I get those, then maybe I'll avoid the shame of never finding love. So just stay calm. So I fill out the Scantron. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja. It's reading my answers. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja. And machines don't make mistakes. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja. As long as you're precise enough. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja. And I've got what it takes. The only 2 skills that you need in this case are to color inside the lines and erase. Color inside the lines and erase. See, if you changed your mind on an answer, you had to erase the old answer really well, or else the Scantron might mark the old answer. Same thing if you weren't neat and you colored outside the lines. If you could color inside the lines and erase, there were no errors with Scantrons. I have made an entire life of coloring inside the lines and erasing. And now it was all going to pay off, because now this Scantron was going to find me love. Maybe I'll get matched with, like, some awesome guy, a friendly guy, a guy from column C. And because we're matched by insides and not our looks, maybe he would see me differently. So I fill out the Scantron. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja. It's reading my answers. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja. It's peering in my soul. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja. It's deciding my future. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja. The machine is in control, making a match with my heart, not my face. If I color inside the lines and erase, color inside the lines and erase. And I look around and wonder who my best match might be. Which of these hot guys will the Scantron pick for me? There's Nick, he's cute. There's nothing between us, but my locker's below his, so I crouch by his penis every day. So Sometimes we talk, me and Nick, not his penis. There's Steven, he's sweet, he was nice as we grew up, like that time in 6th grade when I turned and I threw up in his lap. He said, "Oh, let me help you." Then I ran down the hall, still throwing up, all the way down the hall to the bathroom. Still, his first response was, "Let me help you." That's the kind of guy you want to end up with. Of course, I was so mortified that I hadn't spoken to him since. This has been another episode of Boys That I Erased. But maybe now, the Scantron was going to turn things around. The Scantron was the key to everything. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja, it's solving world hunger. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja, it makes peace in the Sudan. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja, I think it's curing cancer. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja, it's bringing back my dead gran. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja, my hopes might be too high. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja, but it's finding me a man. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja, it's fixing my whole life. Ja-ja-ja-ja-ja, and it will because it can. It will because it can. It will because it can. The Scantron and I in a perfect embrace as I color inside the lines and erase. Ja-ja-ja-ja, in its love database. If I color inside the lines and erase.
Well, there we are, the title song from that wonderful show, Colour Inside the Lines, written by and featuring Jenny Stafford. And what a wonderful person she is, what a wonderful show it is, and what a wonderful conversation we had. I'm incredibly grateful to her for allowing me to play her songs, but also giving up her time so generously so that we could talk about that show. And that show is absolutely a 5-star show. It is a mini masterpiece. And if you get any kind of chance to see it, please do. And remember, that is still possible at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe 2022 because it's available to see at the Space at Surgeons Hall until Saturday the 27th of August, with the exception of the 24th. And that production really does show that you can make magnificent art from a modest beginning. And I don't mean that in any way pejoratively, merely to say that a one-person show with no scenery can really find a way into people's hearts and minds. And this is a show that did precisely that. Now, let's move on to our next show, which is very different in tone and feeling, but was also well worth seeing. It's called Living with Sin, presented by the Cambridge University Musical Theatre Society, and that's the company that originated Six, of course. It tells the story of Cece, who spirals into crisis after the death of her grandmother, but who finds some support from the most unexpected quarter, namely the physical personification of the 7 deadly sins. And together, they and Cece go on a journey of self-discovery, allowing Cece to start to question whether living with sin is not in fact so deadly after all. Now, this was a quirky piece, but a wonderfully quirky piece, and highly enjoyable. It took a high concept and really worked with it, and it's a show that I'd like to see again, perhaps in a slightly more developed, longer version. I sat down with the show's director, and also its co-choreographer, Ilona Sell, to talk about choreography and movement in this piece, because it was so essential for the telling of the story, and to help balance the 7 deadly sins in their human form. I hope you enjoy this extract of the conversation I had with Ilona Sell about living with sin. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Now, the show is called Living with Sin, and of course that's a very open title.
Yes.
Would you care to give us a little explanation of what it is the show's about? And then we can take it from there, I think.
Absolutely. So the show's about a woman called Cece, who's in her sort of mid-20s, and she's at a place in life where she's kind of in a state where she doesn't quite feel like anything's going right with her. The way in which she's like measured success, none of those means are fulfilled. And then she loses her grandmother, who was, this is all before the show starts, by the way, who's basically the most important person in her life. So moves back into her childhood home, and then discovers that the 7 deadly sins are living in her house and are here to help her improve her life. And the kind of music style is quite jazzy, and yeah.
Now, I'll tell you what's interesting to me is, of course, I mean, we can't avoid this elephant in the room. Kurt Weill had a go at the 7 deadly sins some time ago and did them in a very distinctive way. Now, this is the 7 deadly sins with their hair down, I think would be the nicest way of describing it. It's they are, in fact, much less deadly because they are represented by people. There are 7 people in the room, in the house in which she lives, the house she's inherited now from her grandmother. And they are all... they all represent something of the characteristic that they are, their sin, but they're actually a force for good individually and together. That's a really interesting twist. I really like that idea of inverting the 7 deadly sins as actually a way of freeing you up to explore who you are. I think there's a line towards the end about through sin you can actually make mistakes and then learn. I can't remember the exact lyric, but it was, I thought, oh well, that's the point, isn't it? It is only by getting things wrong, failing, committing sins in the broadest sense of that we can advance as individuals and humans. And humanity is a very important thing in this as well. I mean, not least through the humanization of the 7 sins.
Yes.
I've done a lot of talking there, but how did it come about? And when did that concept come about before almost the show? That's such an interesting concept.
So that's a credit to like Joshua and Gabrielle, the writers, completely. And like one of our taglines is like "not so deadly after all."
Well, that's right. I mean, yes.
And I think all the sins. One of their ideas from the start was to give all the sins, except pride, a sin name and like a human name. So like envy is called Emmy and referred to like by sort of her friends, through the sense that they wanted to not depict a stereotype of a sin, but depict an actual human character who'd almost grasped that sin in the best way possible, who had like just the right level of it for a healthy life. Because if someone had no pride at all, that like wouldn't be positive either.
It's terrible, yes.
It's about like striking this balance and like understanding that being wrathful or being proud or something is still really positive. Like whoever you are, you just need to get it to the right balance, and trying to show them as people instead of like a stereotype.
I think you've hit it absolutely on the head there. It's the sins almost on the equalizer, on the soundboard, but actually you have to phase them up and down because all those sins are on a spectrum. And as you say, the opposite of these things, if you have no anger at all, you're likely to be walked over.
Yes, completely.
If you avoid food through avoidance of gluttony, you will starve to death quite quickly. So I
think particularly when the central figure is like a woman in her mid-20s who feels like all these expectations upon her, being like, you should be angry, you should be proud, you should be a bit gluttonous, I think is quite a positive message.
Yes, so she's I wouldn't describe our central character Cece as passive per se, but she is lost.
Definitely lost. She's someone I think who's been waiting to have a career and to have a long-term relationship, and feels that those are sort of the measures for her own success at the start of the show. So when she loses her only real family that she has left, and then isn't feeling like she's meeting any of these criteria for being successful or for being happy, I think she just feels a bit like she's free-falling and doesn't understand what ties she has to provide her with an identity.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it is her journey. But she is also the character upon which the others are performing their magic, as it were.
Yes.
So it's an interesting character, isn't it, of having a central but fairly... I don't want to say bland, because that sounds like I'm underselling the actress who was amazing, but not that. But I'm going to give the parallel that seems a little bit off the wall, but Tintin, from the Tintin books, is a character with very little character, upon which, and surrounded by interesting other characters, or full of personality, Captain Haddock, Professor Calculus, and various others. But you, the reader, I think, project your interests in that character upon that character. So Tintin is interesting to those people who like Tintin, and I'm one of them, because Tintin is the character I think. But if you ever talk what the character of Tintin is to someone else, I have a different idea.
Yes.
I wonder if it's a fairly loose parallel, but I do get that kind of sense that she's a character on whom she's a palette.
Yes.
On which paint is being mixed, not finalised, mixed. And I like that a lot. It's quite, once again, everything here has been interesting, and it's nicely balanced, because it could be very easy that she's nothing and then she's something, or it could be very easy that the seven deadly sins are too much of what they are. You know, it'd be very easy to be the full gluttony, the full anger, the full wrath. Some of these are directorial choices, of course, and I want to talk about how it came to be, but there's another thing I want to talk about in the immediate aftermath of having seen the show, is the interesting choice of how the seven deadly sins act together as a collective. There's something out of Bob Fosse in the way they dress. There's something out of Bob Fosse to a degree in the way they move. And they have that kind of slinky 20s, 30s sound matched with a kind of slinky 60s look, if that makes sense. And it's all very different. They're all very delineated. They all wear very different clothing. And yet they fit together beautifully. But there is a sense, I don't know, if you told me they live together in a speakeasy when they're not in the grandmother's house, I'd absolutely buy that.
Well, there was quite a mixture of a palette for coming up with this all. With Ramisa, our costume designer, who's incredible.
Yes, I should say.
We basically came up with the idea that these sins are kind of eternal, and they've been in this house or maybe somewhere else for a very long time. And we're currently at modern day, but because of their own confidence and like how many different styles of clothes they've lived through, they've all picked up their favourite bits. So whilst we're in modern day, they choose the things they want to keep, hence the like visually mixed aesthetic in terms of period. And then with the choreography, myself and the other choreographer Fionn wanted to kind of pull away from what feels like really tight, sort of, not for want of a better word, like cheesy, and move towards like taking inspiration from like Fosse and also from more distorted, like broken forms of movement to create like a language that felt more complicated and that allowed them to like flow and move as one being as well as like individuals.
The timelessness of it, very much so. I mean, that the clothing absolutely represents that, and the movement. I think you're right. It's interesting you mentioned the word cheesy there, because I am still, and this is a conversation I shall have with many people over the many years I hope yet to live, Bob Fosse is amazing, and yet also I can't work out if he's actually sending himself up or being sincere, or both, or all, and whether his choreography is brilliant or cheesy or terrible or magnificent. And I have a feeling it's a bit of everything. There's certainly a lot of cheese in it, if you want the cheese.
Yes.
But it's not. I'm not suggesting for one second it's a Bob Fosse knockoff, because it absolutely isn't. And you've already explained, but it's actually much more complicated than that. They are 7 parts of a whole.
Yes.
With a W.
Yeah. No. Well, my background in terms of dancing is more in sort of movement than like choreography, whereas Fionn's got a lot of choreography experience, so it worked quite well together. But I thought that the idea of like taking influence from styles like babbling, which is the idea of moving your body like a baby learning to talk, so trying out every possible way of moving each part of your body and
experimenting.
Yeah, really. And in ways it never been before.
Yeah.
Exactly, and the idea that also if these sins have been alive for so long, they're probably a bit restless. They're probably wanting to like adventure with the way in which they inhabit space more so than like someone else. So, and then allowing them to like through these new paths of movements find interactions with each other and sort of breathe as one was something we really worked out, which I think was a lot of fun.
Well, I think, funny enough, I think that comes across. I really do. I think, as I say, they work. I mean, they work together as a collective and they work together as individuals. And the fact that they feel like they can be both in 50 minutes is actually pretty impressive. And they're not on for the first 10 minutes.
No.
But what an entrance they do make. Essentially, I must tell you, of course, because although the title, there's a clue in the title, there are other sevens connected with loss, because it essentially starts with bereavement. Cece is at the funeral of her grandmother, as you say, her only real significant relative, certainly the one who's cared for her. I think there's a mother who's gone, and we're never told any more than that. So, and there's a very strong sense that she's not at the funeral.
Yes.
So Cece is essentially alone with friends and well-wishers, i.e. us, the audience. I mean, that's a nice conceit. But bereavement, I thought it was going to be, first of all, an exploration of bereavement, and of course at one level it is. But of course the thing we know about bereavement is it has 7 stages. And when I saw 7 performers come on, the very first thing I thought was, are these personifications of the 7 stages of grief? They're not quite. They are the 7 deadly sins. But of course they are tackling, the 7 stages of grief are human responses to tragedy. These characters have that sense of having had tragedy, knowing of tragedy, and are helping to pull CC from tragedy. So although they are not the 7 stages of grief, they are acting almost as avatars with it. There seem to be parallels, I thought.
Well, interestingly, one of our actors, Ashley, has been telling people flying on the mile. We overheard her describing the play as the musical as a unique exploration of grief, which we signaled might be a little bit misleading, but is also like pretty accurate actually, in that it ultimately is someone's path out of grief and towards like more security in herself from that. But it is definitely a very unique way of getting to that conclusion.
Well, I would say that. There we are, another extract from one of the interviews that I've conducted at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. On this occasion, that was just a part of the conversation I had with Ilona Sell about Living with Sin, a 4-star show which takes such an interesting approach to the 7 deadly sins. And definitely, as it were, spins the dial on Vile. Now, if you want to go and see Living with Sin, and I hope that you will, you can see it at the Space at Surgeons Hall until and including Saturday the 27th of August. And as I said before, I hope that this show will be developed a little bit further and that we get a chance to see it again. For me, it's definitely got legs, and I don't mean the 14 legs of the 7 deadly sins, engaged or otherwise as they may be in slinky dancing. Now, we've already discussed one musical based on a murder mystery at the top of the programme. That's Cathy and Stella Solve a Murder. But there were others to see, and one that I can strongly recommend is called There's No Mystery in Murder. And in just a minute, we'll hear a conversation with Alexis Rose and Will Lambert, who are the producer and the writer of that show respectively, when we talk about the interesting subject of using songs as a form of visualisation for narrative purposes, which is merely a posh way of saying making songs do more than just be either melodic or push for narrative. Actually, there's another dimension which is often forgotten, which is being able to push the drama, not just narratively, but visually as well. So in just a minute, as I say, you'll hear Alexis and Will in a conversation with me talking about that, I think, quite interesting subject. But before and afterwards, they very kindly allowed us to play 2 songs from the score of their show, and these are demo recordings used in the development of the show. So after the extract of the interview, you'll hear the title song, There's No Mystery in Murder. But before that, it's time for the opening number, Welcome to the Town of Rothersdale.
Welcome to the town of Rothersdale. Hidden in a valley of the bosom of the hill lies a simple northern town with some trouble at the mill. A place that's unaccustomed to the up-and-coming thrill.
There's been whispers in the bakery, some stories at the bar. Something quite unsavoury, quite chilling, quite bizarre.
In a town where nothing happens, nothing special or obtuse. Well, it only seems they've got a chuffing killer on the loose.
Rothersdale, Rothersdale, a town the world forgot. There's not a lot of places quite as dull as Rothersdale, Rothersdale.
We don't welcome outsiders, and besides, no one would ever come to
Rothersdale, Rothersdale.
Rothersdale is where I was grown. It's all I've wanted, all I've known. How could anyone hope to find a place on earth as sweet and kind as
Rothersdale, Rothersdale. We've never had a vandal nor a scandal in these parts.
There's nought that we can't handle. We are bland, but we are smart.
But it seems the times are changing for this rural little gang.
They were screaming at the village hall, but no one heard the bang.
Rothersdale, Rothersdale. Finally, this quiet town
has something dirty going down.
Rothersdale, Rothersdale.
Maybe something's happened
that'll put this shithole on the map.
Rothersdale, Yorkshire, Rothersdale, Yorkshire.
What we've got is all we need.
We've never ventured south of Leeds.
We walk our dogs upon the moor.
We've never had to lock our doors.
A pint of piss,
a cup of tea,
and toxic masculinity. Rothersdale, 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 Rothersdale.
So let's get back to the songs a bit, because obviously they are an integral part of any... Well, you know, you've said how much this came about, or the songs came about, because they had a real practical purpose in illustrating the inner life and the thoughts. But you don't write music yourself, I think, or certainly not. You went somewhere else for songs. How does that relationship work?
Yeah, so me and Danny have been friends for years. Like I think we've been friends since we were 13 years old, and we've always enjoyed musical theatre. But Danny was always the singer-songwriter. So at 16 years old, he was always writing his own songs and going to pubs and performing them there. And he's gone on to continue to do that. So he's sort of had some albums made, and he also was Ray in A Sunny Afternoon on the West End, which made him a lot better guitarist, because playing every single day will do that.
It's quite a big role, I'd have thought.
It's quite a big role, yes,
what
quite
with him
demanding.
being the central character.
Yeah, quite demanding. So he was on there for about a year and a bit, I think. And then when that was sort of coming to the end, I was like, oh, I'm going to think about doing a musical. And he was like, oh, you know what, I'll do the songs for you. And I was like, perfect, that makes it easy. Because I was like, I want it to be a musical, and then I was like, God, who am I going to get to do that? I was like, and I was like, am I just making this harder than maybe it needs to be? But then when Danny was like, I'll do it, I was like, perfect, great. Yeah. And so the way it worked was like, I sort of in the script was like, a song should probably go here, a song should probably go here, and I would sort of give Danny like I would write down like a list of, or a summary of like what should happen and what information needs to be laid out within the song, and then he would just sort of go to town on it. And he's someone we have a good working relationship, and he sort of, he'll ask me questions like, oh, what if this is involved, and he'll sort of push the barriers and make the song even better. And he'll include some of his own ideas, and I'll be like, oh, that's a great idea, oh yeah, and I can use that later on as well.
So the personality of the songwriter is involved in this. It's more than just. He's more than just someone who writes music.
Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
he sort of takes it and builds on it and makes it even better than it ever was. It's not just taking my words and just sort of playing G, A, C or whatever.
His particular talent is the farce lyric,
yes.
as you'll have heard last night.
A patter song.
The patter song.
Yes.
And his talent for rhyme and finding the...
Yes.
I mean, it's just amazing. And, particularly in the final song, which we had a really clear vision for. Like, in Sherlock when... Like, if it had been in film, there would have been things appearing everywhere. And
visualising.
Exactly.
Yes. Whereas this has got to be... I mean, we do get visualisation in this, but it's actually led by the song, isn't it?
Yes.
So that's the framework of the visualisation. That's quite interesting, actually, I think. Sorry, just saying that.
Yeah.
Using a song as a structure. I mean, you'd explain that, actually, obviously, because it was the denouement song, essentially. But it's a framework, a musical framework onto which you can then hook some visuals and explain. It does a lot, doesn't it?
It does, because it takes us into her mind. So, and there's a completely different lighting state used for that song, which is never used throughout the rest of the show. And, it really takes us into her thinking. It snaps us out of the reality, because the whole of the rest of the show is real time, basically. Yes. And it takes us into her mind, and she's rummaging back through her memories, and that's why you see the actors rewinding, appearing, reappearing, popping in, popping out, as she works her way through her memories, desperately searching for what did she miss.
It's a filtering process for her as well, isn't it? She's taking out the bits from each conversation that she needs to pick out in order to try to identify who the culprit or culprits are.
Indeed, indeed. And we built it into the backing track as well. So there's not only the visuals on stage, but there's tiny audio cues going on as well. So we recorded the actors saying some key lines and built that into the backtrack, so that the audience gets as kind of full experience as possible.
Soundscape.
Yes. As she works her way through her memories.
And a soundscape is more than a song in a way, isn't it? I mean, or rather, it's a song doing some pretty heavy theatrical lifting.
Yes.
Yeah. And people often forget songs have that ability. People sometimes think, line, lovely, lovely song. And it may or may not be plot relevant, and it may or may not push the plot forward, but sometimes actually it's not used dramatically as well as narratively. So I'm really pleased to hear that.
And I think it was also important for us not to waste time with songs. So we didn't put anything in which is filler.
No.
There's no massive dance number. There's no kind of, because it doesn't need to be. So
So you have a cast of 4 or 5.
There is a cast of 4.
So massive is a you're pushing at that envelope.
It would
there.
push
That's
it.
quite-
it would
that's fine.
push it, exactly.
Oh, there were two fake legs, so I suppose you could.
No,
you could have a very small
they
Tiller
fake?
Girls line.
Just through the wings. But yeah, we didn't put anything in that doesn't need to be there. Which is actually why Maureen's song is so short, because
But it's the better for it. That's the emotional song. Well,
yeah.
it's not the emotional song, but it's a song that has a great emotional punch.
Yes.
And it is all the sweeter, I think, as a song in its own right, but for us as the audience. And actually, it does what it needs to do very quickly and then comes over very quickly. And you think, oh, fine. It also signifies, in this case, it's signifying her love for somebody.
Yes.
It signifies how simple that love is for somebody, rather than a complex love. I mean, I thought it was very nice, because actually her love is quite... It's devotedly simple, rather than being devotedly complex. And there are complex relationships in this world. I've seen them on television. So.
And I quite liked having that song in there, because with a song like that, you're kind of expecting there to be maybe a gag at the end or something like that, and sort of leading you up the corridor, and then but then it was quite nice. I think it was quite nice to have something that was, most of it is quite fun and silly, but then it was quite nice to sort of have a bit more of a heart to it, because then audiences can be like, oh, actually, there's something else going underneath this as well. It's not just
silliness.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Well, it's relationships, isn't it? I mean,
Yes.
we haven't actually spoken about the central relationship, which, as we said, is for two detectives and their antagonism, but also, it's been done before.
Yes,
when
a few times.
when these detectives get together, it was Moida, which you're both too young to understand, but it was the opening credits of Heart to Heart.
Oh, okay.
Well, as it happens, they were a married couple, but they were very different.
Right.
Obviously, these two are not a married couple, but it's... But it is an emotional relationship, and you can sort of see thawing. The characters have whatever journeys they have, but you can see steps towards each other, antagonistic steps away from each other as crises develop. It's it feels true in that sense, as far as any relationship of some time displayed in an hour can, if you get my drift.
Yeah, because Banks, she's so desperate to solve a crime and to, proceed in her career, and she's so excited by what's happening, again, without giving too much away. But and then you can see that this guy comes in and she's like, oh, I'm going to get to work with this guy. I'm going to, I've never had that chance before. I'm going to learn from him. It's going to be great. And he's just totally disinterested. And to the point of just, he keeps telling her to shut up and, go away and worse. And you almost feel her kind of like heartbreak at but I thought you were going to teach me.
Yes.
And I thought you were going to give me that opportunity. And he doesn't.
But more than that, she calls him out.
She does.
Quite rightly so as well.
She does call him out. She does call him out, which is super interesting, because I think she kind of starts off hopeful and then very quickly realises she's fighting a losing battle, and then starts to call him on his behaviour.
Yes, absolutely. Well, he's got feet of clay, hasn't he? I mean, he is obviously good, but he allowed himself to get jaded.
Yes. Yeah. And then she actually says that. There's that brilliant little lyric in there where she says, he says, I've been at this job for a bloody long time, and she says, I think we can see you're in your decline.
Yes. So let's go back to the song again then. Forgive me, you said you obviously sketch it out sort of in what the song needs to do structurally and narratively.
Yes.
Did you ever plop a lyric in and say, by the way, I think this is, how much did you contribute to the songs? Were you able to contribute to the songs?
Yes, yeah. So Danny sort of will write down the songs, and he'll have, put some lovely things in there, and then occasionally it'll be like, maybe even later on in the writing process, I'll be like, oh, actually, this bit of information needs to be in there, this bit of information needs to be in there. And he'll either do it, or actually that line that we've just said there, I think we can see you're in your decline, that was one of our own.
It was.
We can claim that as our own. So it was something else.
I wasn't going to say that, but
yes,
It's come out somehow.
Sorry, Danny.
Sorry, Danny.
No, but it's a collaborative. Songs are collaborative, or good songs are often collaborative. It's not simply one person in their temple writing their thing, one person in their other garret writing theirs, one person in a secluded room writing something else, and then it comes magically together. It's got to, because presumably the songs will have also brought things which made you need to make some changes to the narrative and the lines.
Yes.
Well,
it's a two-way street.
But also the actual music. So not just the lyrics, but the music. That was very sort of collaborative. So Danny sort of wrote all the words and the sort of chord structure and everything like that, and then he gave it over to Max, and Max sort of took everything and made it even better again.
He set the jelly.
And it was and so we had he sort of did a bit of it, and then I would go to his house and we would just sort of work on the songs, and I'd be like, I I know a little bit of guitar, and I can sort of sometimes hear it in my head. And then what's amazing about sitting with someone like Max is he's like, I can create that for you, I'll be and so
have some French horn, why not?
Yeah. And so in the hardest song, let's say, was the final song, because that was more. It doesn't follow a traditional sort of structure, really.
It's sort of isn't it?
And it's like what we said before. It's a soundscape, and it was trying to find the perfect soundscape. And so that was a real journey, actually, because we'd sort of start off with just like a beating drum, because that was what initially I really like songs with just a beating drum. It's like God's Gonna Cut You Down by Johnny Cash. I was like, okay, it just needs to have that sort of heart to it. And then
I was going to say, can I say in exams they do say show your workings?
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Well, and then we would just sort of we just played, really, and I'd just be like, well, what about if we try a bit of this? And he'd just sort of layer that on, and a bit like, no, that doesn't work anymore. And then slowly it sort of
layered,
and we layered it together, and then I'd sort of sing it, and I'd be like, nah, not quite right. And I think, together we were a bit like, is this going to work? And then, I don't know what it was, something clicked, and it was just suddenly like, that's it. And it was a lovely moment, because I was like, thank the Lord. This is actually going to be good.
We have achieved.
Yes, we have achieved something today. Yes.
Why don't you go make a cup of tea? I don't see any good reason why you should be helping me. I said on the phone that I work best alone. I won't hold your hand and I'm no chaperone. Been at this job for a bloody long time. Sniffed out the cause of a million crimes. And in my history, there is no mystery. No, in my history, there is no mystery. If there's a suspect 9 times out of 10, you don't need to ask questions, it's probably them. There hasn't been a murder that I haven't solved. There's never a twist or surprises involved. I've been at this job for a bloody long time. Realization of all of these crimes is in my history. There is no mystery. No, in my history, there is no mystery. When I was a young lad, on Christmas Eve, waiting for Santa, oh how I believed in Jesus, the Tooth Fairy, Easter Bunny, the magic of all things we cannot see. But in my history, there is no mystery. No, in my history, there is no mystery. No Santa, no Tooth Fairy, Jesus or God. There's nothing there hiding that weird or odd. I've been at this job for a bloody long time, and all I want now is an unsolvable crime. Something to leave me scratching me head, a reason to get myself out of bed. But in my history, there is no mystery. No, in my history, there is no mystery. No, in my history, there is no mystery. In murder.
And there we are, the title song from that very funny but very well constructed musical, There's No Mystery in Murder. And you heard an extract of my conversation with Will Lambert and Alexis Rose. That's a 4-star show, and a show that you can go and see. It's on until Saturday the 27th of August at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this year, 2022, at the Space on the Mile. And if you'd like to find out more about the people behind it, you can go along to their website, which is called www.northerncorner.net. And not only will you find out more about Will and Alexis, you can also find out more about Danny Horn, who's the composer and lyricist, and Max Runham, who's the orchestrator and musical director of the show. And now for the last of the conversations we're going to hear in today's bumper episode of Musical Talk. And that's about War of the Worlds on a budget. What does the Ed Fringe website have to say about this? Well, it says the following. Step aside, H.G. Wells. Take a break, Jeff Wayne. Back to your trailer, Tom Cruise. Lamp House is tackling War of the Worlds, and they're doing it on a budget. Featuring one man, a loop pedal, lots of cardboard, many hats and several terrifying, definitely not made out of paper, tripods, can our hero outrun the aliens, play 25 characters, stop for a tea break and save the day? Featuring a full soundtrack of new music, War of the Worlds on a budget is the musical comedy action adventure we didn't know we needed. And that, I think, is an absolutely fabulous way of describing this very funny, quite surprisingly thoughtful musical which really successfully plays up to its low budget values to create a genuinely moving, thoughtful, clever, funny musical. Now, War of the Worlds is certainly a musical that's been tackled before, as we know. In fact, Jeff Wayne is mentioned there in the description on the Ed Fringe website. So I sat down with Tom Fox and Becky Owen Fisher, who are the people behind Lamp House Theatre, the company that put this excellent show on, to talk about, well, the difficulty of creating a new musical from such well-established material. And we'll also hear about the development of the show once the idea had been had, and of course the very excellent Rebecca Applin, who wrote the songs. And there's a name that you may remember from episodes of Musical Talk, and in particular The Fringe, from many years ago. She's an excellent writer, and all her songs in War of the Worlds on a budget were fantastic. So let's hear from Becky Owen Fisher and Tom Fox. Musical Talk.
I'm Tom Fox. I'm Artistic Director of Lamp House Theatre, but also performing in War of the Worlds on a budget, which we're doing at the space at Surgeons Hall.
And I'm Becky Owen Fisher. I'm the producer at Lamp House and also various other production roles in War of the Worlds on a budget.
Now, War of the Worlds is a piece we all know, and of course, should we talk about the elephant in the room immediately? You know, I believe the name Jeff and Wayne need to be combined together to form another version of War of the Worlds, which of course has had a long history. You start with David Essex. That's a pretty good position. But yours is a completely new version. And it's a delight as a completely new version, and it's a delightful musical as a completely new version. It's also a lot more than just a musical. I enjoyed it immensely. I thought it was wonderful, but I loved the songs as well, But it's... so how did it come to be? And this is the question I'm going to staple onto that. How overtly careful did you have to be about making sure it wasn't accidentally like Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds?
Yeah, I mean, very careful. But that was kind of the game that we wanted to play. Like my dad used to play Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds when I was little, so I knew the album quite well, and that's probably my reference, whereas everyone...
Ooh la!
I know, yeah.
But then I'd read the novel, and it's one of my kind of top sci-fi novels, so it was an interesting collaboration between us to kind of work out how to make a hybrid of those with a little bit of homage to Tom Cruise's film version in there as well.
Only a little bit.
Tiny little bit. So we had a composer on board, Rebecca Applin, and a musical director, Sam Summerfeld.
I know Rebecca from a long time
ago.
Do you? Yes. Oh, she's terribly well respected. Terribly well known. Oh, right. Well, no wonder I liked it.
Yeah. But she was excellent at going, okay, so we've got the Jeff Wayne album. We want it to sound familiar.
Esque,
but also be something very, very different.
The phrase "the War of the Worlds" is set to music, and the moment you hear the rhythm of the War of the Worlds, obviously that also happened in other musicalised versions, because there's other versions as well. And just that rhythm naturally takes you into kind of echoes. And also there's a certain amount of, I don't know the term, I'm afraid, musically, but flanging, or those 1970s sounds.
Yes.
And the 1970s sounds help to evoke it much more than any melody, funny enough. So I don't think this, to me, it sounded like a completely new score, but with echoey ghosts of the more of the orchestration, actually, slightly. The flavours were there if you wanted them. It's like a good wine. How's that? The flavours were there if you wanted them, but it's actually its own vintage completely. I'd say.
Oh, brilliant! Thank you.
I'm really pleased that's come across.
That's really good. Yeah, and Rebecca Applin worked really hard in trying to, like, all of those different layers of orchestration, and because we're a devising company, we were very lucky to have her in the room a lot. And
particularly in the last 2 years.
Yes, I know, right? Yeah. And she layered up, so every day she was on her computer, like putting more in or taking more out.
we had that conversation about how much vocal, because there's a lot of pre-recorded like backing vocals in there, as well as, like you say, those 70s sounds. And
we wanted it to sound like, stop me if I'm talking out of turn here, but I think what we wanted it to sound like was that it was possible that one person could have made all of that. So that kind of techno-y, sort of futuristic-y noise is all
but
the
almost
stuff
bedroom possibilities.
Yeah, it's all the stuff that you get on like your old Casio keyboard.
Yeah.
The idea was that we didn't want it to sound like a full orchestra was doing it. Because it's a one-person show, it needed to sound as though one person could be doing that on stage. So it was all that, kind of based around that idea of like the keyboard effects.
Well, I'd like to go back, and we will talk about the songs again in a minute, but let's go back to its sort of genesis. So you'd had the idea, and you've come at it from two different directions, which I really love. This is a fusion meal, therefore.
Yeah.
But how difficult was the stapling together of visions?
Oh, it was so interesting. I mean, we usually, as a devising company, our process normally starts with writing a treatment, so working out what are the plot points that we really need to hit in the thing, what are the things that people will want to see. We need to have Thunderchild in there, we've got to have a tripod in there, we've got to have a tentacle in there, all of those bits, and then working around that where the jokes come, where the comedy comes. So it usually starts with a couple of pages of A4, which is just points we've got to start with, and then generally Tom, and we had a couple of other comedy performers in the room with us, would improvise around that idea, and then I write down all the funny things, and then slowly it forms itself into a structured piece of work, and then around that going, right, what big songs do we need to punctuate all of this throughout? So it's a really collaborative process.
We had lots of paper on the wall.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
And it moved around every day, and we had a completely different structure at the very beginning, didn't we?
It was very different, and we had two people who were incredibly influential, so co-directors, Merce Ribot and Richard Palmwell, who came in and just helped us to kind of shape those comedy moments and to look at how we could make sure that we were telling the story as efficiently as possible.
Dramaturg, I think, is the word you're grasping.
Well, yeah, sort of. They were sort of comedy consultants. I kind of dramaturgs. They did a bit. It was a
very
big
collaborative.
Sort of collaborative.
But that's wonderful.
Yeah.
But it's the best kind. That's also the most fun, isn't it?
Yeah.
But there's something you said there which I think is really interesting. That actually you boil it down to its basics and then you build up. So basically, from the reductive comes the expansive.
Yes.
And that's quite an interesting concept, isn't it? Because a lot of people want to show everything and show how much they know and throw it all in. But and we know the famous Twain quote about killing your babies when it comes to editing. But actually, I really like this approach, which is you start with your building blocks. What are the essentials? And then from there, you can travel in any direction. What were the paths not travelled? Do you mind my asking?
No, of course.
Well, actually,
or perhaps set upon and then travel back from it.
Yeah.
We were still editing on the train on the way up here.
We were.
As a good fringe show should.
Yeah.
We had... I'm just talking loads, sorry.
No, this is great.
As long as you both agree, that's
fine. Sure. We had a couple
This is lies.
What are you saying?
We had a team of writers in America.
We did have a couple of sections in there that touched on it was Boris Johnson jokes, really. So we had some Prime Minister stuff in there because obviously we have a sort of mini Boris Johnson in it talking about, no, the aliens aren't coming to London, don't worry. And we had a couple of sections in there of they were up-to-date political jokes, but by the time we were in previews they were already out of date.
Well, Britain has been a maelstrom politically and satirically, so I would say this, I got a Boris Johnson resonance, but in a totally different place. Your wonderful zip wire of the rocket travelling from Mars to... And of course, I mean, it was years ago, it was Olympic years, a decade ago, and yet that sort of sticks in the memory, so I wondered if I was going to see a little action man atop.
I'm immediately adding that for tomorrow. So there were some bits like that, and I'm sure there were some other plot points that we from HG Wells.
Yeah, so in previews we had about one of the previews went for an hour and 15 minutes. And we're about 55 minutes here, so we've lost about 20 minutes.
The Edinburgh time slot, so there was still some Mark Twain in there then.
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely.
And but it does cohere, by the way. If you like that, if you'd like the lay ear to confirm that to you.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's very good to know.
It's a really good exercise for anyone, I think, to go, like you say, because you have stuff that is your favourite things, and I love performing that. But actually, if it's not there, an audience doesn't miss it.
Is it relevant?
Is it relevant?
Do you
exactly.
really need it? And is it moving the story along? And that was the question we had to keep asking, because we had some very funny sock puppets in these political scenes, and it was very funny stuff, but it wasn't serving the story in any way. So that went, didn't it? And there was something else, I can't remember what. There were a few.
And then just going back to how we began as well, going, okay, we wanted to respond to the Jeff Wayne, the H.G. Wells book, and are those political jokes actually doing that? They're not really. They're just there for fluff. So that all went.
It did.
But it makes it more transportable in a way, doesn't it? Because if you want to do this again in a year's time, those jokes wouldn't have been so good necessarily. So
absolutely.
You've been very, I think, prescient as well. You know, topicality, unfortunately, it's quickly stale.
Yes, it makes it very difficult.
Whereas you're working with one of the great bits of British literature, in a sense. You know, it's lasted 100 years, isn't it? I mean, it'll go on another 100 years, another 10 years. It'll go. Listen to me.
At least another 10 years.
What we'll see. What I like, if I may say, may I call it the feminist gloss?
Please.
Well, I will do then. The feminist gloss. There we are. I did so. But actually, I really like that element of still being true and affectionate to the original, whilst at the same time gently pointing out that it has one or two weaknesses which are due to the cultural mores of the day in which it was written, ladies and gentlemen. But actually you find a clever way of keeping it intact, or at least travelling in the direction of the original whilst making something of that. And you also described it as a one-person show. It is a one-person show, but with four hands. So it's
I like that. Yeah, we the feminist gloss came out of reality in rehearsals. I really genuinely was enraged that, that the female is so underwritten, and we were really, really aware, I think, during rehearsals of how can you have a man playing a female character? How is that okay? It's not, and so we wanted to be quite specific in our commentary on that, and we went through a lot of versions before we got to where we are.
Musical talk. And there we are, an extract of the conversation I had with Becky Owen Fisher and Tom Fox about War of the Worlds on a Budget, which was a marvellous show, and still is a marvellous show, and is a 4-star marvellous show. It's fun and funny and wonderful. And if you'd like to go and see it, of course you can, because it's still on at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe until Saturday the 27th of August at the Space at Surgeons Hall. Well, we're very nearly at the end of this episode, but there is just one more show I want to talk about. It's called Medea the Musical. And yes, you might think, hang on, Medea, that's one of the great classical tragedies. How can you turn that into a musical? But you can, and it turns out magnificently. It's a 4-star show, and you can see it in Edinburgh at Paradise in Augustins. That's St Augustine's Church, and that's on every day until Sunday, the 28th of August. A good friend of this programme, Michael Gordon-Shapiro, has conducted an interview with the writer and star of that musical, so I'm hoping that we'll be able to tell you more about that in the future. Mike and I saw the show together and we were blown away. It's magnificent. It really is worth seeing. And whilst, of course, it does tackle some rather dark subjects, it does it with a certain amount of humour and lightheartedness, as well as being true to the tragedy beneath. So go and see Medea the Musical as well if you're anywhere near Edinburgh until the 28th of August. And that is it for this week. Thank you so much for joining me for this bumper episode of Musical Talk, where we've had a look at some of the 4- and 5-star shows that you can still see. So if you get a chance, do so. And if you can't, keep an eye out for them online, because these shows may go somewhere else. And in each case, they deserve to. And don't forget, you can hear the full interviews and hopefully some more songs in forthcoming episodes of Musical Talk. And that's not all. Next week we have another Roundup episode of things that you could have seen at the Fringe, which were of a particularly high quality. We haven't featured them this week, A, for time reasons, and B, because they've already closed. So there is no chance of seeing them, at least for the moment, but once again they may also go on somewhere else. So join me again next week to hear more and to get another sense of what this year's magnificent Edinburgh Festival Fringe, its revival year if you like, was like, if you're a lover of musical theatre. But until then, I think it's time to let these background noises wash over you all, and the best way to hear them is for me to stop speaking. So I'm going to do that in the traditional way. One simple word, said by one simple person. That's me, and here's the word goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2022, except for the songs where the copyright remains with the creators. And my great thanks goes to them for allowing me to play their songs in this episode. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. You are not Plinky Plonker.
I don't like to plink or plonk. I